30 years ago, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, was created. It is the most widely ratified international human rights treaty in history, ratified by all UN member countries except the United States. 5 scholars who are each in charge of child rights centers at their universities spoke at the 25th anniversary conference honoring the CRC. 5 years later, they joined to share their thoughts about the importance of the CRC and where child rights are headed.
I'm Yvonne Vissing, and I'm the director of the Center for Childhood and Youth Studies and a professor of healthcare studies at Salem State University. I'm also the U.S. Child Rights Policy Chair for the Hope for Children's Child Rights Research Center in Cyprus.
Hello, my name is Ton Liefvaart, and I'm a full professor of children's rights at Leiden University, the Netherlands. I hold the UNICEF Chair in Children's Rights at Leiden Law School.
So my name's Kate Tisdall. I work here at the University of Edinburgh as Professor of Childhood Policy. My own work is very much committed to children's human rights, seeking to influence, like so many of my colleagues here, policy and practice.
My name is Jane Williams, and I am a professor here in the Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law, and I'm one of the founders and coordinators of the Observatory on Children's Human Rights.
My name is Laura Lundy. I'm a professor in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work in Queen's University Belfast, where I co-direct a centre for children's rights.
What is the CRC?
The CRC is important because it provides an international set of standards for how all children everywhere should be treated. The power of the CRC resides in its ability to mobilize communities to create laws and then policies and practices.
And I hope that this very conference in Toronto can also contribute to that development. Academia has a big role to play in improving our understanding of international children's rights, and to also use that understanding to explain to our students, to our professionals, and to our societies that children's rights are not an option, but children's rights have become part of our joint commitment to improve the world.
What are the accomplishments of the CRC?
Now, the greatest accomplishment of the CRC for us, for me and my colleagues in the observatory, is the way we've been able to use it to frame our work. So we use it as a normative framework and also as a way of informing the way we do our work. The observatory is dedicated to supporting effective implementation of children's human rights. We've done that by developing 3 interconnected strands of work, which we call research, embedding and accountability.
If we take a look at what are the achievements in the first 25, 30 years, I think the main conclusion is that a lot has happened. I think the awareness around international children's rights has increased across the globe. We, as a world, are much more aware of children as rights holders, which has implications for the way we look at children independently, but also in relation to their families and communities.
Making rights real is a strapline of the Scottish Government that it's been using over recent years for its children's services agenda generally and its children's human rights agenda in particular. What is notable that the children and young people here are not only consulted on their views, they go out and do research, they do research with children and young people, and the knowledge that they create is considered both credible and legitimate by the key adult decision makers in the council. The conversations for action are very important to their process. So rather than children and young people just presenting their findings and the adults go and make all the decisions, the conversations for action really seek to ensure that the children and adults are talking about what the solutions would be. And while it is one of the biggest challenges for Young Edinburgh Action, it seeks to ensure that the decision makers are accountable to the young people. We even went further when we were passing our latest equalities legislation to exclude age discrimination for children in relation to provision of goods and services. I have come to really value the CRC and other aspects of law because I suggest it gives a stickiness to certain values. It means that it's not that easy to change these fundamental values if they are in law when there's different political winds or, for example, our recent economic austerity. So I would suggest that there's real value in the CRC and to make it much more real, but also to go much further.
I mean, there have been many, I suppose for me, one of them is the fact that it has provided a kind of global unifying discourse, a way of talking about and thinking about the issues that affect children in all of our societies. Biggest accomplishment possibly is the fact that it has helped us to challenge some assumptions about children in childhood. For example, that they can't contribute to decisions on their own lives, or they don't have opinions on their own lives, or that it's acceptable ever to use violence against them.
The CRC has provided benefits to children all around the planet. It has prevented abuse, it has improved quality of life through education, healthcare, food, and support. And it has empowered students and children of all ages to become leaders in their communities, to become happy, to become healthy, to become successful, and gives them the power to build a better tomorrow.
What are the greatest obstacles to instituting child rights for the CRC?
There are many obstacles, and we know that, and I think they're well rehearsed in terms of political commitment, resources. But for me, I suppose a kind of current concern is really something that's not specific to children's rights, but does play out for children's rights, and that's a kind of resistance to human rights discourse more generally, where we've many societies where there's really shrinking democratic space and a mistrust of human rights and human rights discourse, and children's rights gets caught up in that and doubly affected in some ways, because one, societies are nervous about the use of children's rights, and then societies are nervous about giving children's rights. And I think that's an incredibly challenging issue just right now in the world.
And in my current work, I suggest that I find at least two very stubborn challenges that I think we really need to look at and address. First is recognizing children and young people's participation rights. And secondly is really realizing the ageism that children can face. And this is what children and young people thought of our policy making in Scotland in relation to children's rights. And it captures many of the challenges we face in Scotland, and I would say in other countries that I've worked in. So it's very familiar to hear of children and young people being consulted, but no impact being found on decisions. Some children and young people are asked again and again for their views, where other young people, their views are never asked for nor considered. I would suggest the problem is not children and young people lacking the skills to do this. We've done it for so many years with children to know that we can scaffold them in terms of the skills, and they bring so much expertise and skills with them. So I suggest to you it's not children and young people's skills that are in question, nor their will to participate. What I suggest to you is the ongoing challenge is what colleagues and I have come to call the adult side. It's adults, our institutions, our processes, and sometimes our mindsets that are causing these barriers, these challenges for children and young people's participation. So why do adults find this all so hard? That is right to treat under 18-year-olds differently when it comes to equality and protection from discrimination, because, I quote, there is little evidence of harmful age discrimination against children and young people.
The main obstacles that we've found to implementing the convention are basically ignorance about the convention and misinformation often too. In Wales we're very fortunate to have a very positive and progressive legislative and policy framework, and this helps us on the whole to undertake activities to address those obstacles and try to overcome them.
One of the biggest obstacles to implementing child rights in society is our attitudes about children. They're seen as property of parents and adults. The way that we talk about children and the way that we treat them would be unthinkable and unlawful if you apply those same standards to people of different races, genders, religions, nationalities, or abilities. Creating separate and not equal institutions and opportunities is not in the best interest of the child.
If we look back at the first 25, 30 years of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think we have to be realistic. First of all, we have to acknowledge that international children's rights as a field of international human rights law is still relatively young, which means that we still have to explore its implications. We also have to explore its meaning in very specific contexts, legal context, but also social context. We have to get a much better understanding of the meaning of international children's rights in many existing but also emerging themes. But what are the obstacles? And I think there are many.
Where is the CRC headed?
Well, I suppose, if you track its journey, as many of us have, we can see that there is progression, that actually over time, and we're now in like the 6th cycle of reporting to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, you can see a lot of progression in terms of investment in children, in terms of specific laws and practices that are changing attitudes to children. But of course, there's a huge journey still to be travelled. On a pessimistic day, I would say that I hope it's not one that actually becomes very against the notion that children should have rights. One of my worries is that child rights discourse is unpalatable to so many that it gets replaced by other discourses or frameworks that are not the same. And I've written in the past about notions of child well-being. Of course, I'm not against child well-being, but I worry that when we look at it from a child well-being approach, that we potentially dilute the very significant and unique contribution that rights discourse brings around children's actual entitlement.
How can we, as an international community, but also more specifically, how can the government implement children's rights? And they do that obviously through legislation, policy, budgeting, and monitoring. There's a role for the judiciary to play.
We might challenge the CRC. But it is important to remember that the CRC was a political compromise. It is a treaty of a certain age. Even at the time it emerged from the UN General Assembly, we are aware that there were issues that were under-addressed in it. And as time has changed, things like social media and the internet, for example.
I think that the CRC is going to become more important as the issue of child and youth rights becomes more front and center in the public's eye. Poverty, the increase of global capitalism, the impact of climate change are all going to impact the quality of life of children around the planet.
In my opinion, the convention is strong and is here to stay for the foreseeable future. The fact that almost every country in the world has ratified this convention is surely a strength, but it does create challenges as well. For example, in terms of the workload now on monitoring and examination of state parties by the UN Committee. Some people I know are arguing for a revision of the convention. It's been with us for over a quarter of a century now. I understand that so much has changed in those years. But for me, I think it's more important to concentrate on implementation of the fundamental requirements of the text that we have at the moment, which are so important for a decent level of existence for so many children in the world.
Recommendations for the future of the CRC.
What happens if we started from a premise of children's autonomy, for example?
Whoever controls the mind of a child controls the future. Whoever controls the education, health, and well-being standards of a child controls what will happen to a society.
Well, I suppose, it seems trite, but the reality is that the first step is always awareness. It's making sure that people are actually aware of it. And I don't just mean that know that it exists and know what the articles are. I mean that they actually understand it, and they understand that some of the criticisms that are made against it, for instance, that it undermines parents' rights, are just simply not true. And that through that level of understanding, that we get a shared commitment to the notion that our children are entitled to be safe and to be empowered.
So it's all about the interaction between international children's rights and the domestic realities. And I think we need to have much more research on that specifically. And also the academic world, I think, is still, in this field, is still very young and not focused enough sometimes. So we have to look at ourselves as academics. One of the potentials of the Convention on Rights of the Child, that there's room for diversity. There are concepts such as the best interest of the child, such as the child's evolving capacities, that were incorporated deliberately also to accommodate diversity and differences between children. Children matter much more than before. We have to invest much more in our efforts to accommodate children much more comprehensively and more holistically. It's primarily about children. The rights give children a voice. They should have opportunities. They should be empowered. They should be granted access to justice. And it basically means that we have to invest much more in our efforts to accommodate children in our concerns, in our care, in our decision making, generally and individually. And that means that we have to invest time-wise, interest-wise, money-wise, and above all, we have to invest in children.